previous videos, you went through the first 3 steps of conducting a climate change vulnerability assessment, which was developing a list of climate change indicators, assessing whether you're exposed to these indicators, and how sensitive you are to these indicators. This resulted in a list of potential climate change impacts for your area. In this video, you're going to look at the 4th step of the vulnerability assessment, which will help you to determine what your adaptive capacity is towards these potential climate change impacts. You can approach this 4th step by asking yourself, do I have systems in place to respond to the impact? You usually answer this adaptive capacity question using a rating of either high, medium, or low. Let's look at an adaptive capacity example using the downloaded Excel vulnerability assessment sheet. As we saw previously, when you open the Excel sheet, column C lists all the climate change indicators which have been determined for each sector. Moving across the columns, you will see the different vulnerability assessment steps. We will focus on the adaptive capacity columns for now, from column P onwards. Let's take the same example from the human settlement sector we used in the exposure and sensitivity exercises. Increased impacts on informal dwellings. You'll remember that the indicator description states that already vulnerable dwellings and settlements that are often unplanned and without extensive service or infrastructure are vulnerable to climate change impacts. The adaptive capacity question in column P reads, do you have high, medium, or low adaptive capacity to respond to increased impacts on informal dwellings? To assess adaptive capacity, you need to consider the following combination of criteria. The first is research. Is there research being conducted that will assist you to respond to the potential climate change impact? The second is policy. Do you have any policies or regulations in place that will assist you in adapting to the potential climate change impact? The third is institutional support. Do you have staff or are there organizations that can help you to respond to potential climate change impacts? The 4th is finances. Do you have budget available to implement the necessary projects needed to respond to potential climate change impact? This overall adaptive capacity rating is determined by reaching a consensus during stakeholder consultations. You will discuss the different components of adaptive capacity and decide whether you have high, medium, or low capacity in place to respond to a potential climate change impact. The adaptive capacity ratings are as follows. High means you have systems in place to respond to potential climate change impact. Medium adaptive capacity means there are some systems in place to respond to the potential impact. For example, you may have staff but no budget. Low adaptive capacity means there are no or limited systems in place to respond to potential climate change impacts. Now, to get back to our example, if we consider the human settlement sector indicator, increased impacts on informal dwellings, the adaptive capacity question is, do you have adaptive capacity to respond to increased impact on informal dwellings? To this question, you would then need to consult stakeholders and try to answer the following questions. Is there local research on informal dwellings risks? Are there robust policies and programs in place to deal with informal dwellings? Are there institutional systems to deal with informal dwellings? Is there financial support for informal dwellings programs? Let's say that through the stakeholder consultation process, you found that there is a relocation strategy that is in place and research being conducted by a particular institution on informal dwellings vulnerability to climate change. But there is limited funding for implementation. Based on this evaluation, you may then decide, because there are systems in place, your adaptive capacity is medium for this impact. You can then go ahead and add medium as your response in column Q. If your answer was low, you would then add low in the same column. In the next column to the right, column R, you can add any additional comments to support or elaborate on your response. As mentioned before, it is always a good idea to include comments here so that when other stakeholders review your plans, they can understand why you've answered this question in a particular way. Let's look at another example in the agriculture sector. One of the indicators in this sector is increased risk to livestock. The adaptive capacity question here is, do you have high, medium, or low adaptive capacity to respond to increased risk to livestock? Through your stakeholder consultations, you may identify that there is no research on the impacts of climate change on livestock in the area, and there are no policies to deal with this issue. There is some capacity at the provincial level in the agriculture department, but there is no budget available. You would then score yourself as having low adaptive capacity. You then follow the same process and respond to all the adaptive capacity questions with either high, medium, or low for the different indicators. It is important to remember that you only do the adaptive capacity step for the indicators that you responded yes to for exposure and high or medium for the sensitivity question. If you responded no for exposure or low to sensitivity, you can just ignore the indicator going forward because you are not highly affected by this particular climate change impact in your area. So to recap, in step 1 of the vulnerability assessment, you developed your list of potential climate change indicators. In the second step, you assessed whether you're exposed to each of these indicators. In the third step, you assessed how sensitive you are to the indicators you are exposed to. Exposure and sensitivity together determine your potential climate change impacts. In this fourth step, you then assessed your adaptive capacity to respond to the potential impacts. Finally, if you have low adaptive capacity, you are vulnerable to that particular indicator.